Now, funny stories like the one I'm going to talk about today is basically the reason why I love doing this channel. There's a whole history of Black people in America, in the diaspora, in the world that most of us just don't know. And this story is part of it. It has all the characteristics of an action movie, a Shakespearean tragedy, a political thriller, all rolled up into one. And the most important thing of all is that everything I'm going to tell you really happened. Greetings, everyone. My name is Dr. Jason Freeman. I'd like to welcome you all to my channel. In this video, I'm going to talk about the 1841 slave revolt that took place on the U.S. ship, the Creole. I'm going to talk about who led the revolt. I'm going to talk about what happened. I'm also going to reveal whether or not this is the most successful slave revolt in U.S. history. Now, at any point, feel free to click the notification bell or subscribe to my channel to get more content. So, without further ado, let's begin. So the story of the revolt really starts in Virginia. So the eventual leader of the revolt, Madison Washington, himself escaped slavery and made it all the way to Canada. Now, reminiscent of the film Django Unchained, Madison Washington actually came back to Virginia later to rescue his wife, who was still in slavery. Now, one version of the story, it was said that Madison Washington actually did reunite with his wife on the Creole. However, there's no evidence that that actually happened. And so after Madison came back to Virginia, and this is also reminiscent of Django Unchained, he was actually recaptured. And so after he was recaptured, he was actually sold, put on a ship called the Creole, and was being shipped to New Orleans. Now, the ship left Richmond, Virginia on October 25th, 1841, and the revolt actually happened several days later on November 7th, 1841. So what happened? Well, a lot of what we know happened comes from the testimony of the actual sailors who survived the revolt. And so this isn't necessarily something that's totally fictionalized. There are fictionalized versions of the story, but what I'm going to talk about today really comes from those testimonies from those sailors. Now, one thing we know based on the testimony of the sailors is that the revolt really started when Elijah Morris, one of the slaves on board the ship, approached the person overseeing all the slaves, William Henry Merritt, as well as the first mate of the ship, Zephaniah Giffords. And so the slave basically told those men that some of the male slaves had left their area in the front of the ship and went to where the women were being held on the ship. And so one of the things they did on these ships was to keep the men and the women separate. And so what happened is when essentially Mr. Morris told these men that the male slaves had gone to where the women were, they went there to check. And so when they opened the grating of the hatch of the ship where the male slaves were being held, they kind of checked to see if they in fact were there. That's when the uprising began. And so Madison Washington, leading 18 male slaves, rushed out of that hatch and took over the rest of the ship. Now, in the ensuing battle, there was one white male person who was overseeing a subset of the slaves that included Madison Washington. This man, John Hewell, was actually stabbed to death during the revolt. In addition, several crew members, including the captain of the ship, Robert Insert, were severely injured during the overthrow, during the uprising. However, after Madison Washington took over the ship, which he actually did relatively easy with these 18 men, with some battling, but relatively wasn't necessarily a massacre. Once he took over the ship, after that, none of the crew members, including the wife, as well as the niece and the daughter of the captain, who were also on the ship, none of them were actually harmed after they took over the ship. Now, once Madison Washington and his 18 men had control over the ship, they had to decide where they wanted to go. Now, one of the suggestions that came was to actually have the ship go to Liberia. Now, Liberia was an American colony in West Africa that was actually settled by freed American slaves. Now, one of the men that was initially tricked, which eventually led to the successful uprising, William Henry Merritt, now he actually suggested not going to Liberia because they didn't have enough provisions to make it all the way there. Instead, one of the slaves, Ben Blacksmith, the one who actually killed John Hill, he suggested going to the British West Indies. Now, why? Well, a year before, the U.S. ship Hermosa actually wrecked in the Bahamas, and all 38 slaves on board the ship were actually freed because in the Bahamas, which was controlled by the British, slavery had been abolished. In fact, between 1830 and 1840, 4 American ships that had been forced to enter British ports had all their slaves on board freed. Wow, I guess I missed the part where they covered this in history class. And so William Henry Merritt navigated the Creole to Nassau, Bahamas. And so on November 9th, 1841, the ship arrived in port, and a black harbor pilot actually came on board the Creole and told the slaves on board, the now former slaves, that for the first time in most of their lives, they were now free. Now, of course, America being America, they weren't going to give up their slaves without a fight. So after being informed about the insurrection on the Creole by Zephaniah Gifford, so one of the other man that was actually tricked initially, he was actually the first mate of the Creole, he was tricked, that kind of led to the revolt. So after the American consul in the Bahamas was informed by Mr. Gifford about the revolt, of course, they went to organize American sailors who were in the Bahamas to go and try to retake this American ship. But fortunately for the now free black people on the ship, a contingent of Bahamian soldiers led by a white officer were ordered to go on the ship to keep Madison Washington and his 18 men from escaping. And so when the group of American sailors showed up, Bahamians around the port informed the white British officer that these men were trying to retake the ship. The officer, along with his contingent of Bahamian soldiers, basically ordered them to stand down and to leave at gunpoint. And of course, those American sailors left. And so after that, Madison Washington and his 18 men were detained, while the rest of the people on the ship, including the white sailors, the family of the captain, as well as all of the now free black people, were allowed to leave the ship. And so this brings me to the saddest part of this whole story. So after the free black people were allowed to leave the ship, 5 who are now free black people chose to stay. 3 women and 2 children. Now, I definitely understand that they were afraid, but in my opinion, anyone should have forced them off the ship. And yes, I know they would have been traumatized. And yes, I know it would have been against their will. But once the ship left the port, they went back to the American South. I went back to Louisiana, where these 5 people who were free for while they were in the port within Britain, once they reached the waters off the coast of America, they were now slaves again. So, who knows kind of what was going through their heads? Who knows, again, ultimately why they didn't get off the ship? But it was a mistake, and they went right back into slavery. And so several months later, on April 16, 1842, 17 of the 19 men who took over the ship were freed, including Madison Washington. Now, it would have been all 19, but 2 of the men died while in custody. Now, once these 17 men were free, it brought the total people freed by this rebellion to 128 black people. Now, based on the historical record, there's no evidence that a larger number of slaves were freed by any one slave insurrection or any one event in which slaves actively fought back against slavery. And so, if you trust the historical record, the Creole slave revolt, or the slave revolt on the Creole, is the most successful slave revolt in U.S. history. Now, if you found any of this interesting or informative, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also, please share this video. Also, if you have any questions about the Creole Rebellion or any other slave revolt in U.S. history, please leave those questions in the comment section below. Thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.